Whenever the moon draws the great spring and winter tides against our fragile coastline, we're seeing one of the most powerful, awe-inspiring forces in the whole of nature. Here at Dunwich, a great medieval walled city was slowly but surely swept away by the uncaring sea. They say that sometimes you can actually hear the tolling of bells from beneath the waves. Well, I've never heard that. But whenever I see the grey North Sea sweeping in against this coast, I hear something more than the waves crashing against the shingle. I can hear voices. I can hear the voices of the monks who 1400 years ago brought Christianity to these shores. A flood tide that slowly but surely swept away the old paganism and changed the face of East Anglia forever. When St. Felix brought the gospel to Dunwich more than 600 years after the birth of Christ, the East Anglians were pagan Saxon farmers. Their lives, their beliefs and rituals, even their superstitions were tied to the land and the passing of the seasons. The Christian missionaries sent to convert them were well aware of this and very sensibly took on board many of their customs and rituals, which you can still see today.
May the light of the glorious and risen Christ banish the darkness of our hearts.
Thine be the glory, risen conquering Son.
The celebration of the triumph of light over darkness was seated deeply in people's minds and imaginations. The Saxons lit huge bonfires to symbolically guide the sun back to their fields, to renew the life of the earth. Now, the church couldn't afford to ignore such powerful ceremonies, and given that this one was tailor-made to fit the story and promise of Easter, well, they lost no time in adapting it to their own use. And here it is, over 1,000 years later, still going strong. Round one to the Christians. This ritual is one of the most moving and impressive ceremonies in the Christian church today. The kindling of the Paschal flame, the very symbol that's at the core of Christianity, that Christ, the light shining in the darkness, could drive away the shadow of men's fear of death and allow them to be born again. The atmosphere of this ritual would have been more than familiar to our Anglo Saxon pagan ancestors.
The light of Christ, thanks be to God. The light of Christ, thanks be to God.
At Ranworth in Norfolk, Philip McFadden is one of many vicars who've revived the old Easter traditions of the early church. Carrying the single sacred flame to his congregation, gathered in the darkness of the church, is the symbol of Christ's victory over death. But you know, as the light spreads slowly through the church, it's also a lot like the slow, often uncertain spread of Christianity amongst the pagan Anglo Saxons. When this ceremony was recently reintroduced, the order of service sold out on its first printing. Philip, why is all this so important to you as the Vicar of Ranworth?
Well, I think because it's such a simple, straightforward expression of the Easter faith. I think actions speak louder than words, and the action of new light exploding as it does in the service, and everybody gathered around it and sharing it and passing it on, is a kind of symbol of the explosion of the resurrection, the new life that means. Yeah.
People think, because it's just been revived recently, it's a fairly modern ceremony, but it actually goes back an awful long way, doesn't it?
Way back, probably to the 3rd century, and there was an itinerant nun who went to Jerusalem once or twice at Holy Week and noticed the service, and she obviously was familiar with it, and just mentioned the differences that she noticed in Jerusalem. So it goes way back to the 3rd century, I think.
That's right. I mean, the symbolism of light and darkness goes back even before that.
That's right, and death and resurrection too, and the chaos, darkness overcome by the light. You know, I think that's a very important part of the symbolism.
You know, just because they lived in thatched wooden houses and hadn't polluted their environment, don't go kidding yourselves that the Saxons were primitive. They weren't. They lived the ordered domestic lives of small farmers, simple people with simple needs, that's all. Living in villages like this at Stour, they worshipped the gods of the countryside, especially the great protecting spirit of the earth, the Green Man. Now, Christianity was determined to make an impression on this rustic simplicity, and this was how they did it. The followers of the carpenter from Nazareth set out to impress the Saxons, who were no mean carpenters themselves, by building magnificent structures in stone, buildings most Saxons had never even dreamt of. But it wasn't all plain sailing for missionaries like Felix and Ched and Thursey, who brought Christianity to East Anglia. Oh no, they really had their work cut out to persuade a warrior society that it'd be a great idea to follow this chap Jesus, who let himself get slaughtered without a fight, and who thought it was a great idea to forgive your enemies. Places like Brixworth near Northampton helped to persuade them, one of the oldest and largest Saxon churches in England. Sadly, we're only seeing a shadow of its former glory. Our Saxon ancestors feasted their eyes on a fully fledged Roman basilica. This is lovely. You know, when the conversion first got underway, stone crosses were erected all over England to mark the places of new worship, places where the early Christians could gather together under the sign of the cross until they could get round to building a church of their own. Now, there's thousands of fragments of these crosses survive, but they're usually tucked away in dark, dusty corners somewhere at the back of the church. But not here at Brixworth. Oh no, here it's got pride of place. Because although people have been worshipping in this church for over 1,300 years, the chances are that there was actually a stone cross on this very site long before this magnificent place was built. In time, the splendour of stained glass and painted walls, even the measured chanting of the monks themselves were all brought into play to subtly but quite deliberately point out the poverty of the old pagan rituals. The sheer scale and splendour of this place was intended to stagger the imagination. Round 2 to the Christians. You know, I've always had trouble with this bit of Brixworth Church, because hundreds of years ago when I was at university, I was told that this terrific triple arch was pure Saxon, and that it was something called the Gallery of the Catechumens. In other words, the place where trainee Christians who hadn't been baptized and so technically weren't part of the church were brought to look at the mystical and magical ceremonies that were going on underneath, and that they'd stand here and long for the day when they could be baptized and join the body of the church in the nave down below. Well, it's a lovely story, but sadly, archaeologically, it's not true. This was probably built for the Thane and his family, so that they could watch the ceremony going on in comfort. And it was built much later than the original church. All the same, that story has a ring of truth about it, because there were lots of religions around at the time that Christianity first came into the world that did just that. They kept an element of secrecy and mysticism and exclusion, so that people would feel that when they finally were accepted into the church, they really had a sense of belonging to something very special. That sense of making converts feel a part of something very special was important to the missionaries. They often went out of their way to build churches in places held in awe by the pagans. This field barn, stuck out in a remote and exposed part of the Essex coast, is actually one of the oldest cathedrals in England. In 653 AD, St. Ched landed here at what had once been the Roman fort of Othona. He'd been sent by the monks of Lindisfarne to preach the gospel to the pagan East Saxons. He chose to use the very stones of that fortress to build his church here on its gateway, and he dedicated it to St. Peter, because St. Peter was the keeper of the gates of heaven, and through this gateway, men would pass into a new empire of Christ's glory. This church holds the echoes of generations of Christian worship. Set into the modern altar are stones brought from Lindisfarne and Iona, the holy islands from which the gospel was brought to the Saxons. The sign of the cross has held sway in these places for over 1,300 years. Early Christianity knew all about the importance of continuity of worship. Time and again they set up shop at pagan shrines to try and slowly win people over to their way of doing things. Here at Boughton, near Northampton, the Saxons built the original church right next to the sacred spring of a water goddess, who the Saxons have been worshipping since Lord knows when. Given the sheer elemental power that water exercised over the imaginations of pagan people, it's hardly surprising that archaeologists excavating holy wells and sacred springs have found them absolutely awash with votive offerings. That's people chucking in their valuables to me and you in the hopes of getting a favour done by the spirits of the place. Every time we throw coins into a wishing well, whether we like it or not, we're taking part in a ritual that is thousands of years old. And given how deep-rooted that belief was with people, Christianity really had no option but to try and incorporate those beliefs into their own rituals.
Those who bring children to baptism must affirm their allegiance to Christ and their rejection of all that is evil. It is your duty as parents and godparents to bring this child.
Baptism, with all its symbolism centred around the magical transforming powers of water, must have been something that the Saxon converts took on board really easily. All its elements were already familiar to them.
Give him a name. Harry Connor.
I baptize you.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son.
Tradition has it that in some churches, the north doors are flung open at the moment of baptism so that Satan could be driven from the church as well as from the child, which is perhaps why in some parts of the country, the north side of the churchyard was considered unlucky and people preferred not to be buried there.
This is to show that you have passed from darkness to light. God has received you by baptism into his church. We welcome you into the Lord's family.
Well, the north doors are still there in many churches, so perhaps here's another ritual long overdue for a revival.
Kingdom of God. We welcome you.
Okay, I know, the minute anyone mentions tradition and ritual, up pop the Morris dancers. But here at Thaxton in Essex, every year dancers flock from far and wide for a very special church service. which is surprising really, because Morris dancing is really very naughty. It's about as pagan as you can get. There's much more to all this than something quite quaint to amuse the kids, you know. These are pagan male fertility dances, men worshipping the Earth Mother Goddess and thanking her for their sexual potency. That's why women aren't allowed to take part. Oh, do you know, to me there's a very real sense in which all this takes us straight back into prehistory. Because in one form or another, ritual dancing has been going on since the very dawn of our civilization, from the days when our ancestors were out there felling the forest with flint axes. And all this, well, it's calling on us to bear witness to one of the great fertility rituals that was at the very heart of the old religion. A religion that was ancient long before Christianity ever came to these shores, which turned upon the great truth and mystery of life and death, and which Christianity very sensibly incorporated into their own worship. What was it they taught me at school? I am the Lord of the dance, for I danced in the morning when the world was begun, and I danced in the moon and the stars and the sun. I came from heaven and danced on the earth, for I'm the Lord of the dance. Although the Puritans wiped out the wilder excesses of the ancient fertility dances, enough of them survived to give us an idea of what the early church was up against when it decided that if you wanted to beat them, you had to join them first. Here the Morris dancers file into church, and their horns, the great symbol of male sexuality and potency, are meekly laid aside whilst the men make their offering of a dance before the high altar. How do you feel, though, about what's essentially a pagan ritual going on in your church? Because it's not common, is it?
Oh no, certainly not. But it's no longer a pagan ritual. And the church actually infiltrated the whole sort of idea of natural jubilation. You know, the whole business of celebration. The church actually takes this and sanctifies it and says, you know, this is not a pagan thing. This is a thing which is now sanctified by Jesus Christ and by the doctrine of the church and the understanding of the church. So they take the whole business of sort of natural thing about the dance and so on, and natural jubilation and celebration, and say, now we are offering it to a different situation.
You can't get a better example of what Father Richard means about the church harnessing people's jubilation and celebration than by looking at how it incorporated the Saxons' midwinter festival of Modronach into its own calendar. The Saxons gathered holly, ivy and mistletoe. They consumed masses of food and copious amounts of booze. All the elements of our traditional Christmas were traditional long before Christianity happily seized on them to help people celebrate and so understand the importance of the birth of Christ. The Saxons worshipped evergreens, especially the yew, with its promise of eternal life. And I believe that the Christians built their churches beside those trees, starting the tradition of yews in our churchyards. The sacred tree of the old religion was deliberately allowed to grow in the shadow of the new. Now, if the worship of the woodland spirits was to be tolerated for a little while, then the spirits of the fields must have their turn as well. And so that most homely of Christian ceremonies, the harvest festival, grew directly out of the sacrifices that the pagan gods demanded for delivering good and plentiful crops. The Saxons venerated the green man as the embodiment of the earth's natural powers, the expression of the spirit of death and decay, birth and renewal. God, this place is absolutely magic. But then that's exactly what the Saxons thought too, literally, because they believed in the spirits of the woodlands. They actually worshipped the trees. They came here to listen to the earth singing and speaking to them, telling them of the ancient promise that the cycle of life and death would be renewed long after they were dust and ashes. And you know, perhaps when me and you come to these places, we hear the distant, far-off echoes of those songs, and it's that that brings us such contentment and peace in places like this. Gradually, the church led people to see that worship in the trees and rivers was to hold only a fragment of a much greater truth. That all of them, taken together, were the small, perfect details of the masterpiece of God's entire creation, the work of the one great architect. I don't know. Perhaps it's stretching it a bit, but with that magnificent canopy up above me and the sunlight just filtering down through the stained glass, I just find it very difficult to believe that it was simply an accident of structural engineering that left our cathedrals, the great symbols of Christianity, looking so like the ancient woodland. Thankfully, with every day that passes, the spirit of the green man seems to finally revive and reawaken in us. We feel again the age-old impulse to be the lover and protector of the natural world, not its destroyer. This was a spirituality that the pagan Saxon could take for granted. A spirituality that the church was willing and happy to encourage, even here in a great cathedral such as Norwich. The belief that man was the guardian and steward of God's creation. At the end of the day, it seems obvious to me that the early Christian church weren't just clever enough, they were humble enough to be able to accept and embrace so many of the rituals and the customs of the old paganism, because they actually had something solid and worthwhile to offer people. And that is really ironic to me, because for years we've been far too sophisticated, far too clever to get in touch with the great truth that was at the heart of the old religion, that we're not the lords of creation, we're simply part of it.